Good morning, Cuyahoga Valley. As Joe said, I am one of the elders here. I also spend a lot of my time teaching in our high school students. So if you are visiting, if you're new to faith or you're new to our church, I'm especially glad that you're with us this morning. If you're a high schooler in the room and you haven't found a life group home, we would love for you to join us at our house on Wednesday night. Grab me after service, we'll get you plugged in. It's awesome. Today, we're going to be continuing a series where we've been walking verse by verse through the Gospel of Mark. Now, the book of Mark is one of 4 accounts in the Bible of Jesus' life, but Mark has a very particular feel to it. Mark is concise. He doesn't waste words. Instead, he moves very quickly. He stacks sort of action on top of action. Where some other biblical authors slow down and give us a lot of detail and explain a lot of things, Mark tends to go, here's this happened, and then this happened, and then immediately that happened. That matters for what we're going to read today because Mark does slow down here. And when Mark slows down, it's a really good sign that there's something there for us to be paying attention to. Now, before we get there, let me confess something about myself. One of my many, many flaws is that I am not a particularly patient person. And nowhere is that more obvious than when I am already running late. I don't know if this is a shared human experience or if it's just a personal defect, spiritual defect of mine, but there's something about being 5 minutes late that makes it feel like the entire world is conspiring against you. Every light is a red light. The person in front of you is going 10 under the speed limit. And suddenly, my chest begins to feel tight. I feel frustrated. I'm about to burst. If there's nobody in the car, I probably do burst. And I'm not mad at them exactly, although the person driving 10 in front of me, whew. But what's really driving this, what I'm really mad at is the interruption. I'm mad because I feel like something that's very important to me is slipping away and that nothing really seems to be moving. I start there because Mark 5, 21 through 43, what we're going to read today, is a story that is built entirely on urgency and on interruption and on delay. As we work through the passage, I want to draw your attention to something that will help us listen to this passage well. Mark is using a literary technique that he uses that shows up all over his gospel. Scholars and smart people call it intercalation, which is a really technical way of saying this. Mark starts one story, and then he is going to interrupt it with another story, and then he is going to come back and finish the original. The goal here is that the middle story would help us understand and interpret the story at the beginning and at the end. So today, the interruption is not accidental. Mark wants us to feel the tension in this story before he resolves it. As we walk through this passage, I'm going to pause 4 different times to highlight something about Jesus' response. Whether you're new to faith or whether you follow Jesus for years, my hope is that this morning we can slow down enough to get an accurate picture of who Jesus is. Whether you're new to faith or whether you've followed Jesus for years, my hope this morning is that we be amazed by the presence of Christ. Because in this passage, Jesus does not move quickly. That's the problem, and that's also the point. So let's start where Mark starts. We're going to pick up in chapter 5, verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay hands on her so that she may be made well and live." The first thing that Mark wants us to see about Jesus is how Jesus responds when he is needed urgently. See, Jesus steps off the boat, and once again, Mark tells us that a crowd forms around him immediately. This is familiar territory for Jesus at this point. Crowds press in on him wherever he goes. Before Mark tells us what Jesus says or what Jesus does, he draws our attention to this man who's pushing forward through the crowd, a man named Jairus. Mark tells us his name, which isn't incidental. Most of the people who come to Jesus in the Gospel of Mark remain anonymous, but Jairus doesn't. He is the ruler of a synagogue. He is a visible and respected leader in the community. He's someone who organizes worship, and he represents the religious life in the town. He is someone that people know. And yet, when he sees Jesus, all of that disappears. Mark tells us that Jairus falls at Jesus' feet and implores him earnestly. This isn't a polite request. This isn't a measured theological conversation. This is desperation. This is a father who has reached the end of what he can do on his own. And then we hear the words that set the emotional temperature for the whole rest of the passage. "My little daughter is at the point of death." The phrase matters more than we might originally think when we read this. Many commentators point to this and say, hey, this translation may not capture exactly what's going on here. It doesn't say that she's very sick. It's not saying that she's dying. The language here suggests that his daughter is on her final breath. The moment is critical. Time is not just short, it is almost gone. So he asked Jesus to come with him, to lay hands on his daughter, convinced that if Jesus does this, then she will live. There is faith here, but it's the kind of faith that is shaped and driven by desperation. The kind of faith that clings tightly because there are no other options left. And Jesus responds to Jairus without hesitation. Verse 24 says, "And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him." Jesus agrees to go. Mark tells us this very plainly and very quickly. The request is urgent, the need is obvious, and Jesus responds without hesitation. A synagogue ruler, a known man, a father whose daughter is at the brink of death, and Jesus goes with him. A large crowd follows, a procession of sorts, pressing in, moving towards the streets. And this crowd, and this man, and Jesus are all moving in one clear direction to the bedside of a dying girl. And Mark interrupts it. It's right in the middle of this movement that Mark introduces us to another person. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but in fact grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch his garment, even his garment, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Mark wants us to see how Jesus responds when he is interrupted. Mark slows us down and forces us to sit with this woman's condition. This is not simply a medical problem. Under the Old Testament law that they would have been following at this point, her bleeding would render her unclean. Unclean is a condition that reflects her ability to connect with God and her ability to connect with other people in her society. In this instance, uncleanliness is not about being dirty, it's about being excluded. Excluded from worship, excluded from ordinary community life, and anyone that touches her becomes unclean because it transfers from her to them. Her condition does not just affect her body, her condition reshapes every relationship that she has. Mark adds that she has suffered under many physicians, she has spent everything she had, and instead of getting better, she grew worse. She is physically depleted, she is financially ruined, she is socially cut off. Every human solution and every human institution has failed her. But there's a contrast here that Mark really wants us to see. Jairus is a man with a name and a title and standing in the community. He comes forward openly. He speaks directly to Jesus. He asks Jesus for a favor. No one questions Jairus' right or ability to come approach Jesus. This woman is unnamed. She comes from behind. She does not speak. She does not ask for attention. In that culture, being a woman would have already put her on the margins of public life, but her condition just deepened that divide. So while Jairus kneels publicly, she reaches privately. While Jairus comes forward, she hopes to not be noticed at all. Mark isn't just showing two types of need. He is showing to us two very different social positions. And it's vital that we see this. Jesus gives his full attention to both. Despite their differences, they do share one thing in common, and that is desperation. She says to herself, if I touch even his garment, I will be made well. Now, this isn't some carefully articulated theology of healing. It is a faith that is expressed purely through desperation. She does not ask, she does not speak, she only reaches. And immediately, her bleeding stops. At this point, something has already happened that would have startled anyone in their culture and anyone shaped by ancient Israel purity laws. An unclean woman touched a holy teacher. By every expectation of the purity system, Jesus should now be unclean. And he isn't. Her uncleanliness does not transfer to Jesus. His wholeness transfers to her. In verse 30, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? Jesus stops. The disciples go on, and his disciples say to him, you see the crowd pressing about you, and yet you say, who touched you? And he looked around to see who had done it. The disciples are confused. Why has Jesus stopped? We were going to do an important thing. Why are we stopping? Everyone is touching you. Jesus, don't you understand how little time we have? But Jesus here is not asking about an accidental contact. He's asking about someone that displayed intentional faith. Somebody didn't brush up against him. Somebody reached out for him. And the woman knows that it's her. In verse 33, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be healed of your disease. For 12 years, this woman has carried more than an illness. She has lived as someone whose presence complicates things. Someone whose proximity is a problem for other people. Someone who has learned over time to stay back, to keep quiet, to take up as little space as possible. And Jesus, in this moment, could have allowed her to disappear back into the crowd. But Jesus doesn't. He does not draw her forward in the crowd in order to embarrass her. He draws her forward into the crowd to restore her. By stopping, Jesus has turned a moment of private healing into a moment of public restoration. When Jesus calls her daughter, he uses the same word that Jairus used at the beginning of this passage to describe his beloved daughter. Jesus is declaring that this woman belongs, that this woman has value, that this woman is no longer defined by the thing that made her a problem. You see, the healing that Jesus provided fixed a condition, but it is the relationship with Jesus that actually restores the person. And all of this is happening while Jairus stands there. Mark doesn't tell us what Jairus says. I don't think that Mark needs to. Every second that Jesus is not moving to Jairus' house, every second that Jesus is standing there talking to this woman is a moment being stolen from a dying child. Before Jesus turns back to Jairus, Mark wants us to see something very, very clearly. The same power that just healed 12 years of brokenness is the same power that is still fully present with Jairus. Verse 35, and while he was speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any farther?" Jesus' delay to restore the woman doesn't feel like a neutral delay. It was a delay that had incredible consequences. Jairus has just watched Jesus stop for someone else, heal her, and restore her publicly, and speak peace over her life. And now, before Jesus takes another step, before the story unfolds, we're left with this tension that's being asked without words. Jairus, is this the same Jesus that you trusted 10 minutes ago at the bank of the ocean? Verse 36. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Mark wants us to see what happens when Jesus is trusted in the midst of fear. The English language here shows its limits. We don't have the right grammar to express what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is giving Jairus a command, an affirmative command, something to do, and he's telling him to do it with a continuous and ongoing action. This isn't a belief that stops right now. This isn't something that you do in this moment. It is a belief that continues on from the point where it began and continues on forward. Keep on believing. Jesus is not referencing a faith here that is optimism about an outcome. Jesus' command is to continue trusting the same Jesus whose character has already been displayed and been revealed through the woman. The whole of this passage turns on this moment. Will Jairus continue in faith? Verse 37. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion. People were weeping and wailing loudly. What's striking to me is that Jairus never answers Jesus' question with words. Mark doesn't record a confession of faith from Jairus. He doesn't describe an emotional response of Jairus towards Jesus. There's no speech from Jairus at all. Instead, Jairus just keeps walking. He keeps leading Jesus to his house. Faith in this moment is not something that Jairus proclaims or something that he says. It's something that he does. He continues to trust in the same Jesus that he approached on the shoreline, even though every data point to this point in the story says that that trust has been misplaced. And Jesus allows no one else to come with him, except Peter and James and John. The crowd that was pressing in has been dispersed. So what happens next is not about showmanship. What happens next is not about preaching to a crowd or whipping up some frenzy. It is not about spectacle. When they arrive at the house, it is already filled with noise and grief. It was expected in an ancient Israel culture that if somebody died, that you hired professional mourners. And the wealthier you were, the more mourners you had to hire. And we're told in this passage there are a lot of professional mourners. The rituals of death have already begun. From the perspective of everyone there, the story is over, and then we get to see what happens when Jesus speaks. Verse 39, and when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. And he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Sleeping. If anyone else said this, it would feel dismissive, almost offensive. Jesus says that she is just sleeping to a room full of grieving parents and neighbors and mourners. They all know the difference between sleep and death. They're not confused. They're not exaggerating. The child is dead. So when Jesus says she is not dead but sleeping, the problem is not that they misunderstand him. The problem is that they understand death too well, but they don't yet understand Jesus. Jesus here is not denying the reality of death. Mark has been very careful not to soften that for us in this story. The messengers know that she's dead. The mourners know that she's dead. Jesus knows that she is dead. But when Jesus speaks, he speaks from a different place, from a different perspective. Sleep is temporary. Sleep assumes waking. Sleep is something that you enter into, not something that defines you. When Jesus uses that language, he is not minimizing death. He is redefining death's authority in his presence. That's why the crowd laughs. From their perspective, death is final. It always has been. No one comes back from this. The story is over. But Jesus is not speaking from that perspective. He is speaking from his. And so he puts them out. Not because grief is unwelcome, because what happens next is not for show and not for spectacle. Jesus takes only the parents and the 3 disciples with him, and then Mark slows us down again because what Jesus does next really matters. Verse 41, taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. This is the second time we've heard the age 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. He takes the little girl by the hand, the dead girl by the hand, and he speaks to her like a parent. And if we're paying attention, this should again carry a little bit of weight. This is now the second time in this passage that Jesus has come into contact with what the Old Testament law would call unclean. The woman touched him, and he was not defiled. And now he touches a dead child. And again, there is no hesitation. There is no concern for Jesus about contamination. There's no need for him to withdraw afterwards. And Mark preserves for us the exact word that Jesus speaks in the original Aramaic, what he would have been speaking. He says, Talitha kumi, little girl, arise. Mark tells us what it means. But this is a situation that I think tone matters more than translation. He's already got rid of the crowd. There is no showmanship here. This is not dramatic words. These are not elevated words. These are not mystical words. Rather, they are relational and they are personal. They sound like something a parent would say in the morning when they come and they sit on the bed next to a little girl and say, hey, little girl, it's time to wake up. And immediately she does. Verse 42 tells us that they were immediately overcome with amazement. Not relief, not gratitude, amazement. The kind of amazement that leaves you stunned and quiet because all of your categories have been completely rearranged. This passage is not about Jairus. This passage is not about the woman. This passage is not about the little girl. It's about who Jesus is when death and shame and fear and desperation are all pressing in on our lives. This passage is not ultimately asking whether we believe in miracles or whether we have the right theology of suffering or whether our faith is strong enough to secure the outcome that we want. It is asking us something that is far more personal and far, far more demanding. Do you trust this Jesus? And the reality is, not everyone in this room hears the story from the same place. We all come with different fears, different disappointments, a different distance from Jesus. And the beauty of this passage is that no matter where you're coming from, Jesus is meeting you where you actually are. So where is your heart in this story? Some of you today in the room probably feel a little hurried or anxious. Not because you lack faith, but because God's timing no longer makes sense. You have prayed, you have shown up, you have brought it to Jesus, and then it feels like he stopped, that maybe he got distracted. Hurry shows up in our life when something important feels like it's slipping away. Anxiety shows up when we still trust, but our sense of any control is gone. And the temptation when we're in these spaces is not necessarily to abandon Jesus, but to start to try to manage him, to rush him, to figure out what makes sense that we can trust to Jesus and what I have to do on my own, what Kyle needs to do. If that's you this week, I want you to practice some trust. I want you to reflect and pray and ask the Spirit to show you something that you are trying to control from Jesus. And I want you to intentionally release it back to him in prayer. Not to fix it, not to solve it, but simply saying, Jesus, I trust your character more than I trust my timing. Some of you in the room today might feel hidden or isolated, not because life is hard, but because shame has taught you that you were unfixable, that your very presence is a problem, and that you don't belong near Jesus. That's where this woman lives. She believes that Jesus can heal her, but she doesn't believe that she can approach him. She reaches quietly, hoping that she can be taken care of without being seen, because she doesn't believe that a relationship with Jesus belongs to her. And Jesus stops, and he calls her out of the crowd, not to expose her, but to restore her. And if this is you, you need to hear the message from this passage is that you are not an interruption for Jesus. You belong to Jesus and you belong in this church. If that's you, the challenge for you this week would be visibility. Stay if you might normally slip out. Come up front after service and ask someone to pray with you. Speak your need instead of hiding it. And most importantly, refuse the lie in your heart that tells you that Jesus merely tolerates you. But remind yourself that he calls you daughter and son, and he desires relationship with you. Some of you in the room are watching from a distance, close enough to hear the stories, close enough to see what Jesus is doing, but not close enough to be changed. You haven't necessarily rejected Jesus, but you've kept him at arm's length because distance feels safer, because from a distance you don't have to hope too much. You don't have to risk being disappointed. But distance is also going to keep you from recognizing who Jesus actually is. The response here isn't certainty, it's movement. Take one step that shifts you from observer to participant. Maybe this week you need to pray honestly instead of praying routinely. Maybe you need to invite Jesus, perhaps for the first time, into your life and ask him to change you. Or perhaps you can choose obedience in a small area before you have all the answers. Because the truth is, you cannot stay at a distance and still encounter who Jesus truly is. And some of you in the room today are not doubting Jesus. You're not angry. You're not leaving. You're just tired. You've believed for a long time. You've prayed. You've waited. Your faith has become steady, but no longer surprising. When the girl stands up, Mark doesn't say that the room responds with explanations or relief or theological clarity. He says they are overcome with amazement. And if that's you, the invitation is not to do more. It is to see Jesus again. This week, slow down and sit with a gospel story. Read it. Don't study it. Don't extract a lesson. Don't come up with application points. Just watch Jesus. Let yourself notice his authority and his tenderness and his presence. Faith doesn't endure purely by discipline. Sometimes it needs to be reawakened to the wonder and the amazement of Jesus' character. Which leads us very naturally to where Mark has been taking us all along. Throughout Mark, Jesus has been revealing himself piece by piece by piece. He calms a storm with the word. He drives out a legion of demons. He heals a woman who no one else could help. And now, with a touch and a whisper, he raises a child who was truly dead. Mark is answering a question that he has been asking since chapter 1 of the Gospel of Mark. Who is this man? Jesus is not simply powerful. Jesus is not merely compassionate. He is not just a healer responding to need. He is the one who makes the unclean clean again. He is the one whose very relationship transforms and restores people. He is the one for whom death does not have the final word. And it's this last point that really matters, because we need to be honest about something in this passage that is not promised. We're told at the very beginning there's a large crowd pressing around Jesus. It stretches belief to think that these were the only two people who were suffering, that these were the only two people that needed restored, or these were the only two people that needed healed. That crowd was full of desperate prayers. But Mark never tells us that everybody was healed that day. Many of us know what it's like to pray faithfully and tearfully and still walk home disappointed. Prayers for healing, prayers for salvation for others, prayers for our children and for our spouses and for our parents. Some of us have been praying these for the past week. Some of these have been praying these prayers for years. And the question that lingers is the same one that's kind of hovering in this text, which is, why them and not me? And Mark doesn't answer that question directly, because these miracles in this passage were never about an explanation of all suffering. They were meant to reveal the character of the one who meets us in the middle of our suffering. You see, Jesus heals this woman, and she is still going to grow old. Jesus raises this little girl to life, and she will one day die again. These extraordinary moments and miracles are not the end of the story, but they are guideposts pointing us forward. Every one of us, one day, will be the little girl in this story. Every one of us in this room will lie down for the last time. Every one of us will reach a moment where no physician and no human effort can delay what comes next. And Mark wants us to know that when that moment comes, Jesus will not be absent. For those of us who have trusted him, death is not an end, it is a doorway. It's not ending, it's just sleep. The same Jesus who took a little child by the hand and spoke to her with tenderness like a loving parent is the very same Jesus that walked out of his grave and conquered death. And because he lives, death's authority has been redefined in his presence. In this moment, Jesus is inviting us to see death differently, not just for Jairus' daughter, but for all of eternity. So someday, when we find ourselves in this little girl's bed, those who believe Jesus will come to them, not in fear, not in spectacle, but with a quiet authority and a deep compassion. And on that day and in that bed, he will say, like a loving and tender and caring parent, sit down on that bed with us and say, "Good morning, little one. It's time to wake up." That is why Jesus is worth trusting. Not because he always heals in the now, but because he has conquered what awaits for us at the end. He does not promise us a life without suffering. He promises a future that is beyond death. And the invitation of this passage is simple, but it is not easy. Do not fear. Keep believing. Not because all of our outcomes are guaranteed, but because he alone is trustworthy. Not because delay weakens his power. It doesn't. Because he has redefined the authority of death for all time. Because even when we don't understand everything, we can trust who he is. Will you join me in prayer? Dear Lord, you have conquered death. You, in this world, have stopped and restored. You have raised a child to life. Lord, you have transformed and restored the lives of everyone who has put their faith in you. Lord, your delay does not weaken your power. You can be in two places at once. Lord, you have ultimate authority over death. It has no power over you. And Lord, when we touch you, we do not transfer our uncleanliness to you, but you instead transfer your righteousness to us. Lord, when we feel that we don't deserve to be in your presence, you stop and you draw us out and you say, daughter, son, be well and go in peace. You are healed. And when we lay for the final time, at the last breath of our life, you are a God who, not in showmanship and not in bravado, who with the tenderness of a parent sits down at our side and says, hey, little one, I love you. It's time to wake up. Help us respond to you today with faith and to continue believing. But Lord, most of all, build in our hearts and in our lives a sense of amazement, an amazement of what you've done, and an amazement of who you are. Amen.
Thank you for listening to today's sermon from Cuyahoga Valley Church. We hope you've been encouraged and challenged. If you're looking for a home church and would like to learn more about what we believe, upcoming events, or ways to get involved, please visit our website at cvconline.org.